Kapow, kaboom, we're back. It's 6 o'clock on Thursday evening. Welcome to this week's bumper super action-packed edition of Live with Littlewood. And we've got a huge amount to get through in the next 100 minutes or so. I've got another brilliant lineup of commentators, politicians, think tankers and economists to guide us through this week's events and to hopefully navigate us to less choppy and more prosperous waters. Here's what we're going to be discussing on tonight's show. Rishi reaction. We've heard from the Chancellor earlier today about his job support scheme to replace the outgoing furlough scheme, help for the self-employed, business loans, VAT cuts. Is the Chancellor continuing to protect jobs? That's what he says in his own words. Or are we just delaying an inevitable tsunami of unemployment? Also coming up later on the show, a comprehensive plan. The Chancellor might have spent a reasonable amount today to deal with the short term, but what is government spending going to look like going forward? The government's longer term expenditure plan, the comprehensive spending review, well, the consultation on that comes to a close today. The Treasury says it wants to boost the UK's economic recovery, prioritising jobs and skills whilst levelling up economic opportunities and maximising productivity. We'll ask our experts how they would go about that themselves. And then taking liberties. Boris Johnson says the latest round of COVID clampdowns are necessary to avoid a broader, fuller lockdown. Some scientists say he hasn't gone far enough. Some critics and civil libertarians say he's gone way too far. We'll ask whether the government's got its pandemic priorities right. And will the public continue to comply for another 6 months of coronavirus constraints? The rule of 6 seems to have become the rule of 6 months. We'll be asking about the relatively new still leader of the Labour Party, Keir Starmer. He's had his first party conference as leader this week, virtual rather than physical, of course, and has been criticising and forensically cross-examining the government over the dispatch box. How's Sir Keir Starmer getting on? How's Labour measured up? How effective has he been in opposition? And what is Starmerism? What would a Labour government under Keir Starmer look like? And we're going to be finishing up with the hate debate. A new report says women should be protected under hate crime laws. The Law Commission says misogyny should be treated like racism or homophobia. The report coincides with the announcement that the government's ruling out changes to the Gender Recognition Act. Initial proposals would have allowed people to self-ID to change their legal gender without the approval of any doctors or officials. That news has been greeted with dismay by transgender activists and indeed by Crispin Blunt MP, who's called for Liz Truss's resignation. She was the person who decided not to go down that route. But others have hailed it as a victory for women. We're going to be exploring issues of sex, gender and identity towards the end of the show. Let me tell you which guests we've got coming up later on the show. It will be a warm welcome to the programme to Suzanne Evans, the former Deputy Chair of the UK Independence Party. She previously held a number of roles for the BBC, including as a presenter on the Sunday programme, and writes regularly for national media outlets. It's going to be a welcome back to the show to Mike Graham, talkRADIO's Mike Graham. He's a journalist, commentator, former editor of the Scottish Daily Mirror. He hosts his daily show on talkRADIO, bringing his own special brand of common sense to the airwaves and the masses. We're also going to be welcoming back Andrew Lilico, the Executive Director of Europe Economics, Joint Chair also of the IEA's Shadow Monetary Policy Committee and a regular columnist for The Telegraph. Joanna Williams will be making her debut on Live with Littlewood. She's the Director of CIEO, a new think tank which aims to bring new people and new ideas into the political conversation. So she's a new person coming into our conversation this evening. We'll hear about her new ideas. She's also the author of Women versus Feminism, Academic Freedom in an Age of Conformity, and the associate editor of the online magazine Spiked. It's also going to be a warm welcome back to Toby Young, fierce critic of the government's approach to handling the lockdown and handling coronavirus. So he's so much so he created the Lockdown Skeptics website. He's simultaneously holding the torch for free speech as the General Secretary of the Free Speech Union and is the associate editor of both Quillette and The Spectator. And from IEA Home Team, we're going to be joined by my colleague, Dr. Steve Davies. Steve was previously Programme Officer at the Institute for Humane Studies at George Mason University in Virginia. Before that, he was a senior lecturer in the Department of History and Economic History at Manchester Met University. He's authored several books and featured in and fronted many films here on our IEA London YouTube channel, including our most watched film of the year, Going Viral, The History and Economics of Pandemics. And we'll make sure there's a link to that in the chat and in the show notes below. But all of that's coming up later. I've got two great guests to kick us off. Welcome to the show to Patrick O'Flynn, journalist, politician, former member of the European Parliament for the East of England. His latest Spectator articles are titled In Defence of Boris's Rule of Six and Cut Boris Some Slack. So the Rule of Six is something we'll be getting to later. Patrick, it's great to have you with us here. Good evening to you. Good evening to you.
Good evening, Mark, and great to be here.
And Rob Colvile from just round the corner at the CPS, he's back on the show. He's the director of the Centre for Policy Studies, of course, a Sunday Times columnist and acclaimed author of The Great Acceleration, How the World is Getting Faster and Faster. Rob, good evening to you.
Good evening.
You are perfectly positioned so we can see that portrait hanging in the wall in the back. I don't recognise it. Who on earth is that?
I don't know, really. Just found it.
Yeah, okay. Well, great to have you with us. Patrick, I'm going to start with you. What do you make of the Rishi Sunak's policy rollout today? The furlough scheme's coming to an end, but we have further supports for, if you like, easing people back into work if companies can't take them on, full permanent work 5 days a week. There's going to be some support for that. There's a range of other pieces of support which is going to run on now for another 6 months from November. Has he got this right in terms of protecting jobs and helping businesses, or have we sort of nationalised the entire labour force, Patrick?
I think Rishi Sunak has got things about right, and if he hasn't, I'm sure he'll tweak it. My main takeout from today is that Sunak and the Treasury are about the one cabinet minister and about the one Whitehall department who can look at themselves in the mirror over this crisis and think they've done a decent job. It was a big call to end the furlough scheme, but the right call because it's vastly expensive. And as the Chancellor put it, you can't just have people locked in zombie jobs that don't really exist. So he's tried to put some targeting in. He's tried to go with the grain of a market economy that can adapt. The British economy over the last decade or so has been very good at creating jobs. We'll see if that can apply even in these very difficult circumstances. But I thought also in his statement in the Commons, followed by his media statement, he handled himself very well. He was across all the detail. I think in the House of Commons there was a slight hint that he was putting down a marker that the health experts and Boris had kind of changed the goalposts and meant things were going to be in deep freeze for at least another 6 months. But I think by the time he did his briefing in Downing Street, he dipped his own hands in the blood of that and said he supported the Prime Minister's virus suppression measures. So I think of all the senior ministers, Sunak seems to be the one who emanates the most reassurance, probably calming financial markets. I don't think he could have done a much better job today in the circumstances.
Robert, you guys at the CPS are close to Conservative Party and government thinking. What do you make of this? It's not an extension to the furlough scheme. It's a different scheme, but it's the same sort of principles. Are you with Patrick? Has he delivered this well and got it broadly right? And are the Treasury, insofar as there's any heroes of this crisis, is it Rishi and the Treasury, Robert?
Well, boringly, I'm going to agree, which makes for terrible TV / YouTube.
That's good. I'm going to disagree with both of you shortly. So,
I think the Sunak. This is in some senses a U-turn. Rishi had been saying very firmly, again, in the face of kind of very, very concerted pressure, that the furlough scheme was going to end because it was incredibly expensive, and it was and it was increasingly just serving just to cushion the pain. There were people on furlough whose jobs are just gone, and there's nothing we can do about that. This, I think, who can tell at this point? But I think it's as best as you can say today. It strikes the right balance between keeping people in work where you can, cutting people loose where you have to, and particularly the elements around debt and avoiding basically having companies suddenly face a cliff edge of their own, as in that they will have they will be having to repay the government at the same time as we're trying to get the economy going again. I think it does set up another cliff edge for when this scheme ends in a few months' time. But at that point, we'll deal with that at that point.
Okay, well, I can't have two guests both agreeing with each other and agreeing with the Chancellor. By the way, Robert, what I can see but you can't is Margaret Thatcher is shaking her head behind you over your left shoulder, right? So let me put the counterpoint here. That there is going to be, Robert, extensive unemployment. We know that a good number of businesses are going to go to the wall, possibly through no fault of their own. And whilst it was sort of viable to provide a short-term bridge, if you were sort of running a pub that had to be closed for, 6 weeks, but was otherwise viable, this is now running on for many, many months. And really the plan should be how we reallocate labour. There's a danger here that we're putting sort of everybody's job in formaldehyde, right? We've got to protect current jobs. We know, potentially millions of those are going to go anyway. Wouldn't it have been a better plan to put in place certain measures to make it easier for those who are unfortunately going to lose their present job to move and be employed elsewhere? I don't know, scrap employers' NICs, for example, something along those lines.
So I think yes, to a certain extent, but at the same time, we've moved pretty quickly from the government paying 80% of salaries to the government paying 20% of salaries. The restrictions are on you. If you're not an SME, if you're a big firm, you have to show that you really lost out. So you can't just use this as a kind of nice way to pad your margins. That said, yes, I mean we at the let's do the boasting thing. We at the CPS published a report with Sajid Javid called After the Virus, listing 60 different proposals to get the economy moving. We said, you probably do need a stimulus package. Employers' NI cuts was absolutely at the heart of that. I think the issue is that, we are now, if they were moving in that direction, maybe that was actually the plan for the budget to do, when we were opening up. But now we're not opening up. Now we're kind of still stuck, we're not completely back in the deep freeze, but we're in the permafrost, as it were. And I think there's a feeling that even if you try to unleash the animal spirits via tax cuts, you're probably not going to get that kind of galvanizing effect in the way that you'd hope. So maybe you do that a little bit further down the line.
Patrick, you're of sort of social democratic inclinations, but I never thought the definition of a mixed economy was that the government picks up somewhere between 20 and 80% of your salary in the private sector. Let me tell you one of the worries I've got about it, Patrick, is that I can see the rationale behind it, and I'm playing devil's advocate to some degree, but to lay down some of the challenges. But I'm almost wondering whether this might slow people's return to work. I mean, if you've now got the option of taking people back for 3 days rather than 5, maybe you actually think, well, I'll do that rather than taking them back for all 5, or making a decision that you just can't keep them on anymore. Do you think there's a danger, Patrick, that the approach to the virus was to make it a sombrero? That now seems to be the approach to the recession, that we know this tsunami is going to come, but we'd rather it didn't hit us yet. And should it be about protecting present jobs, present businesses, present structures, or should we be a bit more imaginative about the overall economic landscape, such that people can find new and different jobs in new and different sectors?
Well, I think Rishi Sunak spoke about that, didn't he, about the economy adapting. And I think he struck a balance again, trying to give every chance to a job that might still be viable. But, the overall lesson here is that there's no miraculous economic prescription that can work while the public health people and the Prime Minister are doing this stop-start. There's not a smooth direction. A few months ago, Boris Johnson said, give it 12 weeks and we'll be on the path back to normality. All that happened was we suppressed the virus, and then as we went towards a bit of normality, it's picking up again, and the public health experts are saying, let's do another 2-week circuit break. Well, what then? So I don't really think investment decisions, big economic changes, what's the best way forward, we can't really know that. Will we get a vaccine in January? I certainly have my doubts about that. Will we get this amazing whole population instant testing daily regime? That sounds like what Boris used to call the moonshot. I doubt that's going to happen. I would much more like a kind of move towards coping and living with the virus, and shielding the vulnerable, and carrying on a move back towards economic normality. So I think the Chancellor has been landed with a plate of something unpleasant on his lap, and in fairly quick order has come up with a sensible sort of bridging moderate position.
And Patrick, let me just, on the government's wider strategy then, there is this sort of stop-start. I mean, I just as not as an economist or anything, just as a regular person, I assumed that sort of March and April would be real lockdown, and then it would ease a bit in May and June. And with each passing day, it would ease. And even though if you didn't know the timeline, you knew that tomorrow was likely to be easier than yesterday. How would you go about it? Do you think we should continue to ease? Because, I mean, on the other hand, to be sympathetic to the government, I mean, they don't know what the infection rates are going to be in December. So how can they tell you how much we're going to ease things around Christmas time? But do you think the stop-start is adding to even more uncertainty, making planning nearly impossible for anybody running a business or even running their own personal finances?
Yes, I certainly do. And even sort of some fairly depressed entrepreneurs who are hanging on are not closing down the business and going to have another go. Well, they needed it to be as you described, that whatever the pace is, it is coming back. And that's completely gone out of the window. I mean, I'm afraid I think we have the sort of public health leadership and a somewhat spooked Prime Minister who now have a vested interest in prioritising measures that will tend towards lower COVID deaths in the short term, but higher indirect negative consequences, higher deaths in the long term through other things, because they're all pinned to Patrick Valence's statement that 20,000 deaths would be a good result. And they've come in with twice that, and they know there's a public inquiry on the way. So we have a spooked leadership here. And personally, I think people like Professor Hennigan at Oxford and a fresh team would be very beneficial. I think it's a bit early to say that should include the Prime Minister, but certainly a fresh team around him who don't have a vested interest in this ultra cautious short-term keep COVID deaths to a minimum and forget about the deaths of people from other health conditions and all the negative effects of the economic carnage.
Yeah, and so Robert, let me come to you. Do you think there's a danger here? And it sounds preposterous to say, but if you like, there's too much attention specifically on COVID. We're now trying to prevent any, death from COVID, but the effects on it, not just sort of second round effects of causing a lot of damage to the economy, which causes all sorts of associated health problems, but almost first round effects that, cancer treatments, the suffering, lots of people aren't going to hospital for fear they'll catch COVID if they've got another minor health condition that might become a major one. Have we, even though it sounds odd to say, Robert, just made COVID sort of too dominant a feature of our public and political life and policy making?
I mean, I think there's certainly a huge issue around NHS and people kind of been fighting going to it for it. That said, the reason that people are concerned about COVID is brutal. I mean, there's lots of people who will say, your chance of getting it is actually probably not going to do much to you, and that's true if you're under 65. But as soon as you get into the elder age groups, it is the fatality rate among people in their 80s is 15%. That's extraordinary, and there's a reason that half of the tests at the moment are going into care homes. And I think the problem is that it is basically you can't cocoon off. I wish you could. You can't stratify the population by age. people are, younger people are gonna see older people, and older people are gonna want to actually go out and stuff. So it's a really tricky thing to do. And I don't envy anyone making any of these decisions. And I think that they are. Even the people who are arguing for greater lockdowns aren't neglecting the wider consequences. They are just sort of saying, well, actually, it's better to get the pain in earlier rather than have more pain later if the disease spreads more.
Robert, can I just challenge you a little bit on that? Obviously we can't perfectly stratify the population by age. We can't suddenly move everybody over the age of 70 to Manchester and everybody over the age of 80 somewhere else. And of course, young age cohorts and older age cohorts mix. But can't we actually have a pretty decent policy of stratification? To sort of say, you've just mentioned the over 85s of fatality rate very high, might be a very sensible decision if you're over 85 to shield. If you spend all of your life only mixing with people in your own age cohort, go about your normal business. Couldn't we issue, guidance primarily, conceivably rules? If you're 23 and work in a care home, you might be subject to rules. We can't have you going out to the nightclubs on a Saturday night, but couldn't we attempt to stratify rather better, don't you think, Robert, given how much data's in and how age contingent certainly the fatality rates appear to be?
Well, one of the extraordinary things about the crisis is the way it's made all of us, yourself included, apparently a believer in the awesome power and the efficiency of the state. I actually think, people, throughout this crisis, we behaved as though Downing Street changing its guidance or changing its slogan is going to cause everyone to change their behaviour. I think, in fact, most elderly people, one of the reasons I don't think the second wave is going to be as bad as the first wave is just that people have changed their behaviour. Most elderly people know perfectly well how horrible this disease is and are moderating their behaviour accordingly. We are all we are all putting on the hand wash. We're all wearing the masks when we have to. We're all that little bit more cautious in our day-to-day activities. I think I'm struck by just before the first lockdown, London was a ghost town. Everyone had sort of made a decision to isolate, and now actually I'm seeing when I'm even though the announcement of the new restrictions, people were saying it's going to destroy the city centre economy. And actually the city centre looks, I was in a restaurant the day after that it was announced, and every table was full. Admittedly, this is a restaurant in Westminster where everyone is kind of lunching their sauces or what have you. But, I think, there were statistics today, only 18% of people who are told to self-isolate are actually self-isolating. I think, the government can issue all the guidance and rules it wants, but ultimately it's down to people to do what they feel is best for them.
I've got to correct Robert there. I'm not very confident that people follow government guidance or indeed that the government gets the rules right. I am more confident that, let me come to you, Patrick, that people can make their own decisions if the information's available to them. My parents are in their 70s; they're therefore at higher risk than I am. You might want to advise my parents, or I might want to advise them. It doesn't require Matt Hancock to do it, to take better care, not to go mixing. But I'd advise them to do a number of things. I'd advise them not to go skydiving as well. Can't people make their own decisions? Patrick, would you be more of a guidance man than a law enforcement man? How should we tackle it?
Yes, I certainly would. And the initial point you made was effectively it's the economically inactive age groups who are at risk, but we're slapping controls on the economically active. And from an economic point of view, that's not sensible. We've got one story that's going on at the moment at Glasgow University, where they've had a massive outbreak. And they've had 124 confirmed infections at 2 halls of residence and probably hundreds more cases. And Glasgow University came out yesterday, rather sheepishly, I thought, and admitted they're not aware of a single person having been hospitalised. Now, I would suggest in the medium term, it's actually a benefit to the vulnerable age groups if all the undergraduates on their campuses give each other COVID and recover from it and become non-infectious. They're building what used to be called herd immunity, but that's now thought to be a brutal term. So we talk about community immunity. So it seems this virus, to me, it's actually sending out some helpful signals potentially from an economic point of view. It's telling us either to give quite forceful advice to the over 80s or people with comorbidities, you better shield, or at least to them, if they're a pretty sensible bunch, and to make their own arrangements and to help them do that. So having tried the shutdown and being back, we're not quite at square one, and I agree with Robert, the second wave looks like it's a lot gentler than the first. But everything points, particularly as the Treasury's expended, I won't use the Boris Johnson term for when you throw a lot of money against the wall, but they've expended a lot of money following this public health approach that hasn't worked. I really do think that the public are still on board with that largely, and so are all the opposition parties. But rationally, an intelligent government, of the centre right should be leaning more towards shielding the vulnerable and managing a rate of COVID infection that doesn't overwhelm hospitals.
But that part of it, which was obviously, Patrick, the initial goalposts, that's been lost to the mists of time. The concerns that we hadn't built enough Nightingale hospitals or whatever. I mean, that's, we've got masses of capacity. That's sort of mission accomplished, right? I mean, I appreciate that that's not much consolation to those who are still catching it or dying from it, but it was protect the NHS, which I take to mean, capacity in the NHS. We're absolutely, fine as far as that's concerned.
Well, I think we think the NHS can take about 20,000 COVID patients at any one time. And at the moment, I think we're at 1,300 for England. I think that will probably be about 1,600. So we're not at much more than 7 or 8% of the capacity. So, yeah, it's not. And of course, they must look at the exponential increase. But at the moment, for England, I've been following these figures. They're averaging going up about 70 a day, and it bumps around a bit. It doesn't look like we're on a strong exponential trend at all. So as I say, I think the current regime are spooked and are aware that they've delivered something that was twice as bad as what they'd hoped, and completely focused on limiting the short-term COVID toll, almost to the exclusion of any other amount of carnage in other related fields.
Okay, Robert, Patrick, stay with us. But I'm going to welcome another couple of guests to the show to get their quick thoughts on the on this winter economic plan. We don't obviously have a budget. We're now making things up as we go along rather than budgeting over the long term, but we're going to come to the long term in a minute. It's a great pleasure to welcome Andrew Lilico, Dr. Andrew Lilico, back to the programme, the Executive Director of Europe Economics, Joint Chair of the IEA Shadow Monetary Policy Committee, regular columnist for The Telegraph, as I've said. Andrew, great to have you back on the show. Good evening to you, Andrew.
Good evening.
Good. We can hear you loud and clear. And Steve Davies, our Head of Education here at the IEA, historian, polymath, all-round genius. Steve, great to have you with us.
Thank you for that. Yes, good evening.
It says here on my script, evening, Steve, how's that Mancunian weather? You must have fantastic eyesight, because I can see pretty clearly here you're sitting in the upstairs room at the IEA. So so you can only really comment on the Mancunian, you can only comment on the Westminster weather, I guess.
The Manchester weather was fantastic for the last 2 weeks and then suddenly went back to normal at the weekend. So it's as ever.
As ever. Andrew, let me start with you. Just your very quick thoughts on the winter economy plan. Patrick and Robert, a cautious thumbs up for Rishi Sunak. Do you think that he's got it right? What would you have done differently in terms of these emergency measures, Andrew?
Well, I think that he obviously had to do. He had to make some kind of change. The furlough scheme couldn't continue forever. They'd already announced that they were going to terminate it. But in the context of some kind of second wave, which I thought was always very likely, he wanted to do some sort of phasing out of the furlough scheme or a replacement scheme for it. So what he's done, I think, is a scheme which does a little bit of buffering of the effect. I think there'll still be quite a lot of people to become unemployed. If you've got restaurants that are shut down, it's not going to be attractive for them to have their staff being paid, you paying them 2/3 of their salary or something like that. So it's not going to be any use them working 1/3 of the time if there's no work for them to do at all. So I would imagine quite a lot of the people that are notionally eligible for the scheme will end up becoming unemployed anyway. But that's just the way of it. If you shut down large parts of the economy, there's going to have to be some kind of adjustment. I think that they've deferred the adjustment probably too long. It seems to me that the economy got a bit of a bad break here, in that it's a total jobs machine that the economy was for many years. And I don't know, it doesn't seem obvious to me that the economy wouldn't have been able to generate new kinds of jobs for people if you'd had extra unemployed people coming from these various hospitality venues and so on. What they would have done, of course, it's not really for me to say, but maybe they'd have been delivery drivers or helping things in warehousing, packing stuff together. With the economy's changed, right? So we have a different sort of economy, so we probably want different kind of jobs. And that process had to occur at some point. And it seems like it's going to be now. One other thing to say on that is that one particular area is actually in central London. And much of central London, where there's commuter areas, I know that Robert was just saying that some of the restaurants were okay in up in Westminster. But if you go around Fleet Street and areas like that, where close to Chancery Lane on where my office is, absolute ghost town. Just nothing. And I reckon that pretty much every business in the central London that depends on commuters is bust, whether it knows it or not. And that's not going to come back, because with a second wave, the firms are going to adjust over the winter. A lot of firms are going to go to being fully no office. If they do go back to having offices in the future, they'll have people going in a couple of days a week, or have an office space which is much lower density. So there's going to have to be large changes, and that's the reality. And the winter package is just supposed to buffer some of the effects of that.
Steve, your take on this? I saw earlier in the YouTube chat, Elliot on the YouTube chat saying socialists have wanted a 4-day week forever, and here's Rishi Sunak saying, "Hold my beer." We're bringing it about for us. What's your take on this sort of incrementally getting people back to work? Is it a smooth path, or is this just delaying the inevitable?
Well, the government does seem to have decided to try and ease change rather than embrace it, to sort of adapt what Andrew just said, because it's pretty clear that what COVID has done is to accelerate quite dramatically a change that was probably going to happen much more slowly. So instead of having a decade or maybe even more than a decade-long process of people in jobs relocating from city centres to suburban clusters, it's now happening in a year, basically. So the strategic question for the government is, do you kind of ease the pain in some way, or do you say, well, okay, this is the way things are going to be, it's a big change, so we'll adjust to a new world? I suppose intellectually I would prefer the second course myself, given that this is a change that you can't stop. You might as well go with the flow and ride the wave, or whatever you want to call it. But on the other hand, I can see the politics of it, which are that you don't want to have really intense pain in the short term, which is what you will have. You do want to try and block the edges off that. So I can understand the political reasoning behind what he's done. And to be fair, I don't think it's been too damaging. He hasn't done anything that's going to really cause disastrous problems.
But Steve, on that point, don't you? Where I think I would sympathise with you as well. We already have a pretty sophisticated welfare system. I mean, isn't that what's supposed to pick up the strain, rather than trying to persuade, as Andrew was saying, a closed restaurant to bring back a bar staff for 3 days a week rather than 5? Why don't we say, well, the restaurant's closed, you're on universal credit, might be more generous for a while for the sake of argument. Why don't we just do it that way?
Yeah, I tend to agree with that as well. I mean, it's a question of, do you have a sudden, quite abrupt change, which you then cushion through the welfare system, or do you try to slow down but still accept that there's going to be lots of places going out of business? I think it's a matter of the politics of it against the economics. The economics argument, I think, is quite straightforward. You don't try and slow it down. You basically trust to the openness of the jobs market to ease the transition as effectively as possible. But politically, a lot of people find abrupt change very wrenching. There is one other rather base reason, though, for not doing this, which is that the kind of things Andrew was talking about, the decline in office space take-up in the centre of London and elsewhere, is going to lead to a collapse in property values there, and also rents. And there's a lot of loans and other things secured on the value of commercial and property in city centres. So I think the Treasury may be a bit nervous about the impact on the financial sector of a whole lot of major loans suddenly going south. And that could well be a reason why they're trying to give people time to refinance and sort out the debt. So I can well think that that's a major motive.
Okay, I want to move on to the slightly longer term. We've dealt with the sort of tactics of dealing with coronavirus and job retention day to day. But is there a comprehensive plan, or is there going to be one over the longer term? The consultation on the government's comprehensive spending review comes to a close today. Initially, way back in the day when things used to be normal, the government planned to outline its spending plans for the next 4 years later in the autumn, saying it wanted to prioritise jobs and skills, level up the economy. The government's obviously, Rishi's already scrapped his autumn budget, saying it wouldn't be right to outline long-term plans during the current crisis. We don't know what the long-term looks like. Not even sure, I'm told, whether the comprehensive spending review will now go ahead, at least on its initial timetable. But I want us to consider the longer-term picture of the economy. Robert, I'm going to start with you. In 2018, government spending accounted for about 40% of GDP. This year, I think most estimates suggest it will be about 54%. Back in 1976, when we went cap in hand to the IMF, it was about 46%. UK debt, you'll know, has now hit 2 trillion, just gone above 100% of GDP. Office for Budget Responsibility predicts UK debt will be 104% of GDP by the end of the financial year. This is pretty grim overall, even if, let's just say for the sake of argument, we give the government a pass on spending lots of money to deal with this short-term crisis. What should they put in the comprehensive spending review over the next few years, Robert? Well,
so I mean, first of all, I think that a multi-year CSR is ridiculously ambitious at this point, and it's because we don't know how much tax we're going to get, we don't know how much spending we're going to get, we don't know what growth is. It's all up in the air. Longer term, I think the priority for me is dashing for growth. I think we are lucky that this crisis has hit at a time when borrowing costs are at a historic low. I think most people accept that there are one-off costs associated with this pandemic, but it doesn't make sense to try and repay all that immediately. I mean, I think the fact that Rishi, the reports that he was going to announce tax rises on business in particular to try and get an extra 20 or 30 billion to help close the gap, I think it was a very good thing that those haven't come in, because the last thing you want to do is choke off a recovery by raising taxes. In the longer term, the problem is the pressures on state, even without this, the pressures on state spending were upwards. The government at the budget, they wanted to spend more. They needed to fix social care. They need to build new hospitals. They need to, there's the capital and infrastructure spending which is going to come in, which I'm actually probably keener on than you are. There's just a lot of pressure upwards, and the opinion polls seem to show that people are not really in the mood for austerity 2.0. So I think I think we need to confront this, and we need to say that there are as Mrs. Thatcher said, as Charles Dickens said, do you income £20, 1 shilling, happiness income. We need to, the state can't carry on spending beyond its means forever. So once the recovery is underway, once we've started to repair the damage, I think at that point we need to have a very serious look at exactly, are we getting value for money from everything we're spending? And the answer is, the state is spending an awful lot of money, and it can't possibly be getting value for money for all of it.
Patrick, you and I have discussed these things before. You consider me a lunatic, small state libertarian, but I'm really just trying to have a debate here about maths. I mean, as somebody who's probably less sceptical about the efficacy of state spending than I am, don't you just think on a kind of broad, it's all got to add up level, put aside this year, let's write off this year, the disaster of this year, but over the longer term, we are simply living beyond our means. Tax take, I think, is the highest it's been for about half a century in terms of GDP. The government keeps insisting it's going to spend more than we bring in tax. Balanced budgets, I think we've had one of those since 2001. What would be a sort of social democratic type approach to this? Do you think spending is just too high and we've got to make some serious priority decisions?
Well, I'm sure we have, but I as Robert said, there seems to be a public appetite for instance, a bigger state input into social care. We live now in an economy where the state is apparently the great guarantor of all the banks. We have the state as a guarantor of everyone's bank account up to £85,000 in multiple institutions. The state is a guarantor of everybody's pensions, or 90% of them if they're drawing occupational pensions. Ronald Reagan had his famous jokes about, the scariest words in the English language: I'm from the government and I'm here to help. And the other one was to a government person, don't do something, just stand there. Well, that they were good jokes, but the last 10 years, I don't think suggests that's fair anymore. And we have had this tax gap growing. Rishi Sunak today, I think it was in answer to Gordon Rayner from the Telegraph, did go a bit philosophical for a while and express general support for the idea of people keeping more of their money. And that's a good thing, but I can't see the path to it, with Boris Johnson wanting to merrily build here, there, and everywhere, levelling up the 10 years of austerity that we've had. Something's got to give. Whether it's new taxes on Amazon and people like that, and big American-owned corporations that kind of gear their accounting to away from paying a fair share of tax in this country, that might be so. But I fully agree, if you let marginal tax rates in particular rip, you're going to disincentivize wealth creation. If Rishi Sunak can find his way through all of this in the next 18 months, then he's something of a genius.
Well, the other great Reagan thing on how the government treats business, I think he said that it's very simple to describe what the economic policy of most governments are. If it moves, tax it. If it keeps moving, regulate it. If it stops moving, subsidise it. Andrew, what's your view of, God knows whether this actual comprehensive spending review will run into the stand because of the prolonged coronavirus crisis. But Andrew, what's your take on where and how we get the state to manageable, sustainable levels of public expenditure, let alone optimal levels if you want the private sector to breathe with a relatively lower tax burden? How do we get, if you like, even the debate back onto those grounds, Andrew? And what sort of steps would you like to see in peacetime in the comprehensive spending review?
I think patience is going to have to be key here. The reality is that we don't know where. I think that any kind of comprehensive long-term spending plans at the moment are largely delusional, because we've no idea what our starting point is. The economy could be 10% smaller, 15% smaller, 5% bigger than it is now. We've no idea. We've no idea how long the COVID crisis is going to last, or where we're going to be at the end of it. So that's all largely delusional. In terms of where we're going to go over the medium term, well, the reality was, I thought that there needed to be a bit of a pause on austerity during the period of the transition at the end of when we were leaving the EU and over the next couple of years after that. But once we go out a few years' time, it's going to have to be more austerity. And the fact that we've had all of this spending now just means that the austerity that there's going to have to be is going to have to be bigger. That doesn't mean it's going to all come at one go, but over the medium term, we need to get back to a situation where the debt to GDP ratio is something like 40%, like it was before we entered the 2008-2009 crisis, instead of 100 and something percent, which is where we're going to be at the end of all of this. And there's a big gap between those two. You can't get there quickly. But over time, that's where you should be looking to get back towards. I think some countries have had situations where they've had a surplus. There's no necessity or any particular merit about carrying a great anchor of dragging along debt payments. It's better to try to get rid of some of them. One other problem with carrying a big anchor is that you face a continuous temptation to allow just a little bit of extra inflation all of the time, and every now and then maybe a big dollop of inflation, because that erodes some of that. And I suspect actually that inflation is going to be part of the recipe here. I think that we've had such aggressive monetary growth during the period of the COVID crisis in the US as well. I think that we're going to see an international burst of inflation coming out of the back of that, and that will resolve some of these matters in a not particularly happy way.
Although some of those, Andrew, and liabilities are sort of index linked, aren't they? I mean, inflation isn't the cure to government debt quite that it used to be.
Absolutely, but a lot of it's not. So some of it is and some of it isn't.
Okay. Patrick and Robert, before I let you go, and Robert, you'll know what I'm going to ask you. Patrick's first time on the programme. He might not know what I'm going to ask him. We run on this show the highly market-sensitive Live with Littlewood Optimism Barometer, where I ask each of our guests how optimistic they are for the prospects of freedom and prosperity in the United Kingdom over the period of the next 2 or 3 years. I aggregate them all, usually screw up the long division and give the aggregate number at the end, and the traders on the FTSE and Wall Street respond accordingly. Robert, let me start with you. How optimistic are you feeling over the next 2 or 3 years, not just the next 2 or 3 weeks?
I'm at about a 4, unless they listen to everything the CPS and IEA say, in which case a 10. But
you think there's a 4 in 10 chance they might? Or no, they're only going to listen to 40% of what we say? How do you get to a...
I think there are things we can do, there are, but it's whether we have, we haven't talked about deregulation, for example, housing reform. There are things we can do to get growth going, but it's the question of whether the government has the courage and discipline to do them.
And Patrick, your thoughts next 2 to 3 years? How optimistic are you? An integer between 0 and 10.
Well, I'm a 5 out of 10. If they do come up with an effective vaccine, I do think that in those circumstances there would be really good prospects for a big bounce back. I'm a bit sceptical about whether they will. And overall, the United Kingdom is a bit of a beacon around the world, still a pretty stable society. So there's no reason why we can't have some good times ahead. So I'll say 5 out of 10.
5 out of 10. Patrick, Robert, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for your very middle of the road optimism predictions. Lovely to see you both. Look forward to catching up with you soon. Take care. Enjoy the rest of your evening. We've got Andrew and Stephen. Please stay with us. We've got 2 more guests joining us now. I'm going to get their thoughts on the future of government spending over the long term before we move on to other topics. Making her first appearance on Live with Littlewood is Suzanne Evans, former Deputy Chair of UKIP, held a number of roles at the BBC, presenter of their Sunday programme, writes regularly for national media outlets. Welcome, Susan.
Hi.
Lovely to see you. Lovely to see you. Lovely to see you. And a welcome back to Mike Graham, journalist, commentator, former editor of the Scottish Daily Mirror, hosts his daily show on talkRADIO. Mike, great to see you. I bet you wish you were running your own independent republic right now, don't you, Mike?
Well, Mike, a happy coincidence. That's exactly what I was doing earlier on today, and I should be doing it again tomorrow. Believe it or not, more and more people seem to be joining it from what can only be described as the dark side. But obviously, it's a place for me to advertise my wares.
So I might be looking for political asylum in the independent republic of Mike Graham before long.
Yeah, please come over, but whatever you do, don't wear a mask.
Okay, got it. Suzanne, I want to start with you. We were teasing out the this comprehensive spending review, which has obviously hit the buffers because we're not in anything approaching normal times. God only knows when we'll be able to make some of the judgments that Andrew was talking about. We don't know what the size of the economy will be next year within a very, very wide margin of error, Suzanne. But longer term, Suzanne, where do you think sort of state spending should be at? We seem to have got into a situation where we're raising 38 or 39% of national income in tax, spending always north of 40 into the mid 40s. And then when a bad year hits, we're spending north of 50%. I've written a piece for tomorrow's Telegraph on this, that we're basically living beyond our means in the good times and living colossally beyond our means in the bad times. Suzanne, what would be your prescription over the medium term in a comprehensive spending review?
Yes, I think I absolutely have to agree with you, Mark. And I think one of the things that struck me most about the headlines that we got from the comprehensive spending review and the sort of the kind of overarching objectives, if you like, they were woolly, fluffy stuff that actually had no meaning to it whatsoever. You know, it was typical government obfuscation. It was stuff like nonsensical sound bites about how securing the UK's place in the world and all this stuff. There's absolutely nothing concrete there at all. And ultimately, of course, there was also no cap on spending announced, and the pledge was made to increase spending despite the absolute horrific times that we're living through at the moment, where we are literally chucking out money like water. It's incredible, isn't it? In the run-up to the last few general elections, the Conservative government of the Conservative Party has made a huge amount of the fact that there is no magic money tree, and attacking the Labour Party for suggesting that there might be, and that the Conservatives are planning to spend enough. And yet suddenly we are finding billions from absolutely nowhere, and continuing to roll out policies relating to coronavirus, which are going to trash the economy even further. Now, I'm absolutely with the IEA when it comes to a smaller state and lower taxes. I know the IEA's got a report coming out shortly which suggests how it thinks the government should be reacting to all this, and I think the measures there are very good. We have to cut regulation, we have to lower taxes, particularly corporation taxes. It's the old Laffer curve. It works. The less imperiled people feel by the amount of tax that's going to be taken out of their pockets, the more inclined they are to pay taxes, and of course the more inclined there is going to be inward investment, entrepreneurship, and so on and so forth. So I'm absolutely 100% behind that. But where are we now with this Conservative government? If the Conservative Party is no longer the party of low tax and the small state, but the party of high spending, who actually is there in opposition? What party is there out there actually that might take some of these ideas that the IEA has to heart and actually run with them?
Mike, what's your take on it? What would state spending be in the independent republic of Mike Graham? It looks like this year that spending's going to be around about 54% of national income. I think most economists agree that in the Soviet Union, it was about 70% of national income. And in most of the fastest growing countries in the world, it seems to be about 20% of national income. So we're positioning ourselves much closer to the former Soviet Union than the most successful countries in the world in terms of getting economic growth. How much tax and spend would there be in the independent republic of Mike Graham?
I harken back to the 80s quite a bit, and I rather like Reaganomics. I rather like the idea of President Reagan saying, we would like you to spend the money the way you want to do it, rather than you giving it to us, so that we can spend it the way we want to do it. And I think if they're going to make this massive commitment to public spending, what they've got to do is give some tax breaks to companies and give some tax breaks to individuals, so that they can actually go and spend the money that they want to spend, which will rejuvenate the economy, restart businesses. I mean, we're already seeing, I'm getting loads of people calling me in saying, look, I've had to give up my job. I was in the hotel business. I don't even know if it's coming back within the next 2 years, never mind within, the next 3 months, once the furlough ends and once, this latest kind of stipend ends. And I think people will spend their way back to prosperity, but they've got to have the money to do it. And unfortunately, if all we leave behind are these kind of civil service types who sit on their laptops at home, eating their, avocado sandwiches and talking to each other about how great it is, they don't have to commute with the great unwashed anymore, and they don't have to run into any working class people who might have to give them a sandwich. In that case, we're never going to get back to anything. We've got to get. I mean, we seem to be making some progress with getting people back to work. That's all been blown out the window now. Boris has clearly gone completely staring bonkers. Man, I saw him this afternoon addressing the United Nations panel on climate change. I mean, what the hell's he doing? Talking about lagging houses. I mean, nobody's going to have a house if he carries on like this.
Okay, so I'm guessing taxes would be a lot lower in the independent republic.
They would be extremely low. I mean, I don't know what this late. I mean, the Conservative government for the last sort of 7 or 8 years has been absolutely penalising and attacking small business. I know this because I run a small company, and the amount of taxes that I now have to pay as a company director, as somebody who employs people, and the red tape that has now been wrapped around being a company at all, apart from being a massive company where you can avoid paying any tax that they are supposed to be levying on you. It's an absolute shambles what the Tory party has done to small business in this country. They need to small business will save the economy if they let it.
Okay, I want to move on to we've covered spending a bit. I want to move on to the restrictions on our freedoms. As Mike was said, I think it would be obligatory not to wear a mask in the independent republic of Mike Graham, but taking liberties. Is that what the government's been doing? Another week, another raft of restrictions. We've had the rule of 6. It looks like we might have 6 months of these restrictions. Curfews for bars. I was joking to a friend of mine who in an EU member state country earlier today, saying, well, we've got 10 p.m. curfews now since Brexit, but you guys have probably got a directive for a standard European bedtime. But we've also got tougher fines. potentially talk of calling in the troops, much bigger fines if you don't wear your mask in the appropriate place, people being told to work from home again if you can, this sort of guidance of if you can. I've never quite known what that means, only make a journey if it's essential. Suzanne, what do you make of the overall encroachment on freedoms? Is this a proportionate approach to dealing with a spreading virus, or have we just got confusion layered on confusion now?
Confusion, incompetence. I'm not quite sure, Mark. I think, like many people, I went quite willingly into lockdown initially because this was an unknown virus. We didn't know what was going to happen. We didn't know, I don't think, how dangerous it was going to be. But then we seemed to continue to carry on the same path when it turned out not to be nearly quite so dangerous as we thought it was going to be. So at no point really was the NHS ever overwhelmed. I think the Nightingale Hospital here in London treated 14 people before it was mothballed. So the great doomsday prediction simply didn't happen. And I have become increasingly shocked, nevertheless, at the way in which the government is continuing its authoritarian pathway to try and keep us all at home, stop us from working. I mean, my business was shut down for 4 months. I mean, it was grim, absolutely grim. So I was going through my savings like water. And again, it goes back to what I was talking earlier about the economy. If the Conservative Party isn't also the party of liberty and freedom, then who is? And the other thing I feel very strongly about is that there's been no opposition to this really, because Labour, their approach, far from being the party of opposition, has been the party to say, actually, you're not going far enough. I remember Keir Starmer back in April suggesting that nobody should be allowed to take any exercise at all, that all non-essential workplaces should be shut. And I remember seeing him holding a meeting out of doors wearing both a face mask and a visor before the masks were mandatory. So the Labour Party, if you think the Conservative Party's record on liberty and freedom is poor on this, the Labour Party is even worse. But the most frustrating thing I think I find is that we are being told to do all these quite difficult and I think damaging things without any real evidence behind them. And the evidence is emerging now. The evidence is emerging from places like Sweden, which haven't had the high rates of COVID deaths despite not having any lockdown. And you still don't have to wear a mask in freedom. People are socially distancing, but things are pretty much back to normal and the economy has not really been harmed at all. And yet still we are looking to authoritarian China, which I think kicked off that initial response. I sometimes wonder how things would have been different if perhaps the virus had started or at least first come to light in Sweden rather than China. I think we saw these horrific scenes of people in China literally being rounded up, pushed into quarantine, these massive hospitals being built, and we followed that model as opposed to following the Swedish model, which of course has turned out to be much more beneficial for Sweden.
Well, listen, I'm going to come back to what we make of Keir Starmer and the Labour Party in a few minutes, but Steve, I wonder if I can come to you on the sort of regulatory burdens here. We've touched a lot on tax and spending and protecting jobs. Where do you think the government's got to on its list of various rules and regs, and how many people can sit together and what particular geometric shape you need to be in if you're running a barbecue in your back garden, and whether you're wearing a mask if it doesn't cover both of your nostrils completely and all of the rest of it? Is this a sort of sensible, proportionate balance, or is this pointless regulation gone mad? Stephen?
Well, as I think your question indicates, what they certainly have done is provide stand-up comedians with material for the foreseeable future, basically. I think the thing is this: what we have in the short term here is an emergency. And in an emergency, you do have to do things that you wouldn't normally do. The problem is that the government has done, excessively. As Suzanne said, they've followed the most authoritarian kind of model and decided that what you need to do is have the smart experts work out what needs to be done and tell the rest of us how to do. A couple of problems with that. One is that the experts always tend to overestimate how much they know and how much control over the world that they have. And B, they disagree amongst each other for good reasons. It would be rather alarming if they didn't, actually. And so consequently, what you get is, secondly, not only excessive regulation, but confusing, contradictory and misguided regulation. And I think, as any soldier will tell you, you don't mind getting orders from the top, but if you get different conflicting orders from the top, you really do And that, I think, is the situation we're in now.
Andrew, what's your take on the nature of the regulations? I mean, I can remember something. If I was going to defend the government, which I'm not often minded to do, but if I was going to, it's actually that when you're in this slight sort of no man's land of not sort of total lockdown and full curfews and the police, arresting you if you leave your house, but you're also not in a free society where you can go about your business as normal. It's almost impossible not to get confusion and even contradictions. But Andrew, do you think the kind of regulatory framework we need to abide by, they've got about right or completely wrong? How would you have done things differently on things like gathering points and face masks and all the rest of it?
I think it's total chaos, and I think that at the heart of the chaos is the fact that the government has not felt it needed to have any strategy for bringing the crisis to an end. That's the fundamental thing. We can put up with all sorts of restrictions, as Steve was saying, if they're short-term restrictions, if there's an end. But there is no end. The government hasn't said, well, we think that there'll be, we're going to wait for 3 months for there to be some therapies, and if they haven't improved then we'll do this. Or we're going to wait for a year for there to be a vaccine. But if it's not available within a year, then we're going to do this. That a plan needs to include contingencies and some way to make it all end. And I think one thing to think about is, if you told people last March that casual sex was going to be banned for a year, then would they have gone along in the first instance with the actual scheme? Because this is not something where it's turned out that it was just 3 weeks of some sorts of restrictions, which was some of the things at the start. And if anybody raised any kind of objection, then everybody said, oh, you're going crazy within the first few days, just shut up and put up with it, it'll be over in a few weeks. This was always going to be a matter which was going to be taking a year, 18 months, 2 years, who knows how long. There's no real endpoint to this at all. And the government needed to have a statement, some kind of plan for how it would come to an end. And at the core of the chaos is the fact that they've never really felt they need to do that. And I think that that's really important now. I don't think parliamentarians should be granting them these additional powers, which they're currently trying to get through Parliament, without the government formally setting out a plan for debate against other plans. If you don't have a plan, you see, then you don't feel any burden to show why your plan's better than anybody else's. And there were other kinds of things. We haven't had any explanation of why a shielded herd immunity strategy might not have been better, for example. Why an attempt at some very aggressive lockdown that led to eradication wasn't a better strategy. There are all kinds of other things that you could have imagined them trying to do. Instead, what they've done is just this manana, something will turn up kind of a strategy. And I don't think that that's remotely good enough in a free society for us to surrender our liberties to the government on a completely open-ended basis, where the government says what time you can go out, whether you can go to your job, who you can have sex with. It can't be the way that a free society works for us to provide an open-ended offering to the government of all of our liberties in this way. If they're going to take them, they need to say for how long. It needs to be highly conditional, and we need to know why that's the best thing compared with some other way of doing things. And they just haven't tried to do that at all.
Mike,
part of the reason is that I think the general public, to my shock, have absolutely bought into this wholeheartedly in the main. I mean, almost everybody is complying with all the rules. And I actually have found this really shocking, particularly rules that involve snitching on your neighbours, snitching on your friends, not giving your parents a hug, staying away from your father's funeral. This is an astonishing level of public compliance that I would never, frankly, have expected from the British people.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, all of this British bulldog spirit stuff, I mean, it's beginning to look like a bit of a myth. I mean, God knows how compliant we would have been if Adolf Hitler's German troops had actually managed to arrive here. Mike, what's your take on all of these intrusions into our normal behaviour and the level of compliance of the big bulk of the British population? Is this a response? Is it we have to take some actions, one might argue, to try and stop the spread of this thing or to minimise it? But what's your take on the face masks and everything?
I kind of agree, and I'm not saying don't wear a face mask. I'm just saying choose whether you wear one or not. I wouldn't tell people not to wear one. If you want to wear a face mask, go for it. But don't make everybody else do it if they don't feel the need. And I think Andrew, Stephen and Suzanne all made very good points there. The point is that we're now confronted with what has been described as science since March, which clearly is not scientific in the slightest, right? The R rate, for example, is based on a whole series of data which involves picking up things like, oh, people have gone back to school. That means the R rate goes up. It's got nothing to do with whether there's more infections. People have gone back to work. So the R rate goes up, right? So then you can go, well, now the R rate's up above 1. Yeah, because you've gone back to school. They should have expected the rate of infection to go up. They should have had a better strategy. But what we can clearly say is the introduction of masks, the introduction of the previous lockdown, the introduction of the new rule of 6, the introduction now of a curfew at 10 o'clock has done nothing. Nothing at all. We're still now supposedly getting the highest recorded rate of infection. What they should be doing is looking at that rate of infection, seeing whether it's actually damaging anybody, which it clearly is not in the same numbers that it was, and let those of us who are willing to go back to work and who are willing to go back to the pub and to the restaurants of this country and feed the economy, let us get on with it. Because otherwise, every time somebody shouts fire, everybody's going to run for the hills. And you can't work like that. I mean, can you imagine Boris Johnson endorsing, before he faced near death in St Thomas's Hospital, a ban on casual sex? I mean, he would be the last guy to say he could ban casual sex because he was on his bike round to old, what's the name's place from the Spectator.
I'm glad you said what's the name, rather than naming
on?
anybody. Yeah, but do you think, Mike, that there's been, to Suzanne's point, are you surprised at how broadly compliant the population are? I mean, I live right next to Clapham Junction railway station.
Right.
I'm a fairly compliant person, but I kind of thought, I bet you nobody will wear a face mask. I'd say 90% of people are wearing masks.
I mean, you're in Clam, for heaven's sake. You know,
the compliant bunch. Yeah.
It's the home of the Ramonas. You know, if you go around the country and you talk to the people that talk to me on talkRADIO, they are not compliant. They're fed up to the back teeth. I think living in London, we get a very false sort of picture of what are now what I regard as the bedwetting class of people who all do rather well. They've all got very nice houses. They quite like working from home, and they like spending time with their family and their children. You know, not that I'm saying there's anything wrong with that, but, you know, I used to look forward to, when I was married many years ago with young children, to go to work, get out of the house, go and meet some real people, and not be, you know, changing nappies every 5 minutes. You know what? You know, I think there's quite a larger number of people than you think who are not compliant, and maybe then none of them are in London.
That's really interesting. Andrew, do you think that the scale of this crisis has been overstated and therefore misunderstood? I can't actually remember the numbers now, so it's risky for me to quote them, but there was some opinion poll that asked the British electorate what proportion of the population do you think have died of COVID-19? And it was something like the average guess was 7% of the population have been killed or something like that. Boris Johnson said in his broadcast, quote, "COVID is the single biggest crisis the world has faced in my lifetime." Is there an overstatement of this from the, if you like, the leadership and public authorities, and therefore those who are minded to believe, foolishly perhaps, that politicians and others tell the truth, also believe the problems are hugely bigger? I mean, I can remember with the 9/11 and afterwards, people saying Al Qaeda is the biggest threat to us in our lifetimes. People seem to have forgotten the Soviet Union could eviscerate the human race in 4 minutes by hitting a red button. What's your view, Andrew, on whether this has all been, I'm not saying it doesn't exist, I'm not a denier, but has it been sort of overstated by a factor of tens or hundreds?
Well, I think saying it's not as bad as if we had a global thermonuclear war is, it's a kind of a low bar.
Well, I would still say that was the biggest. I mean, I'm disagreeing with the Prime Minister. That was the biggest threat in our lifetimes, was the Russians hitting the button.
But, if we'd really had 500,000 people dying in the way that was being suggested, then that would have been an event comparable to a large war, large wars in the 20th century. That would have been a very, very serious event. And actually, the estimates of death rates haven't changed very much. The Public Health England numbers have actually gone up a little bit to 1.4% from the initial. You remember they were saying 0.1 or 0.9% initially. So it isn't a situation in which really we've decided that. It is true that the estimates of what proportion of people need to be hospitalized has come down very dramatically from something like 20% to something like 4%. And what that means is that the danger of the health service being completely swamped and people dying for lack of medical attention really is nothing like as high as it was to start with. And I don't think that the government has really fessed up to that point as much as they might have done. It just, that opinion has completely changed. So the chance of things being swamped in the way that was being suggested in the start really doesn't exist in the same way. I do think that that we're talking about. I don't buy the story which says that if we'd done nothing, then we wouldn't have had a lot of people die. My point about these things isn't that it's not that there aren't a lot of people dying and a lot of other people suffering. My point is that losing all of your liberties for years is an enormous cost. So to be sure, a lot of people dying is an enormous cost, but we seem to have just underestimated what the value was of being able to live our lives in a normal way. And 67 million people, that I think, apart from anything else, that if we'd said from the start that locking everybody up for months and then completely distorting our lives for years wasn't an option, we would have found some other way to resolve this matter without waiting for years for a vaccine or having hundreds of thousands of people die. We would have worked out another way of doing it. And I think that we have a big part of this. And I don't think you can really say that a situation in which 1 billion people have ended up in lockdown isn't a very significant event. I mean, that is one of the most significant events of our lifetime. But I just don't think that the ways in which they've tried to address it have involved the right kind of concepts. I think that they felt it was too cheap just to take away everybody's freedoms and that nobody would care. And as you say, sadly, up to this point, people by and large have gone along with that. Just one last thing I will say is, I think also that another thing government hasn't really fessed up with is the following. A key argument against lockdown in the first place was that if you locked down, you would end up with a second wave through the winter, and you would just end up moving around who died in the end without changing the number of people who died very much. And with a second wave coming, and it seems to me that with the weather cooling, we're likely to have much faster transmission. I think this is probably all going to be over by February now. I think that that rather indicates that the first judgment was right. And the point that the government might have been right in the first place, and the advisors who said that, and that's proved to be right by the presence of a second wave, isn't something which has really entered the public consciousness yet.
Okay. And Andrew, just before I let you go, what is your optimism rating? You're aware of this highly market-sensitive Live with Littlewood optimism barometer.
That's right, I am. And I can tell you I've had a huge 50% rise from 2 to 3 in my ranking.
That is, Andrew, things are moving in the right direction and fast.
That's right, exactly.
50% growth since you were last.
Right. Donald Trump would say it was the fastest growth rate ever seen in these things. So I think that we are going to have all of this resolved over the winter. I think that the business with vaccines is going to largely prove to be irrelevant in the end. And I think that we just force majeure will make us come to some kind of resolution. I think that we're going to have a lot of people die. I think there'll be a grim period for the economy. But if you look a little bit further ahead, I think things will resolve a little bit quicker. And that's the source of my optimism now. Andrew,
it's been great having you. Thank you for joining us. And I need to invite you on 7 more times in order to get that rating up to 10, if my mathematics are correct. It's been great having you. Suzanne, Mike, and Steve, stay with us. Andrew, thank you very much indeed. I've got 2 more guests to introduce now. We've got a lot to pack in. A warm welcome to the show to Joanna Williams, her first time on the programme. She's the director of the new CIEO think tank, which aims to bring new people and new ideas into the political conversation. So it's great to have Joanna with us as a new person in this political conversation. Looking forward to her new ideas. She's the author of Women versus Feminism, Academic Freedom in an Age of Conformity, and an associate editor of the online magazine Spiked. Good evening to you, Joanna. Great to have you with us.
Hello, thank you for having me.
And Toby, great to have you back on the show. Good to see you with your free speech poster behind you, fiercely sceptical about the government's lockdown approach. You've created the Lockdown Skeptics website, and you also, as I've just mentioned, hold the torch for free speech as the General Secretary of the Free Speech Union. Toby, great to have you with us as well. I can see you're on mute, Toby. I'm about to ask you a very important question in just a moment. I'll make sure we get you off mute. Joanna, let me start with you. What do you, we're going to move on to considering the Labour Party in a minute, but just very quickly before we do, what do you make of the restrictions on liberties that have been imposed in order to deal with with the virus? Proportionate?
Well, I think it's an
insane?
incredible overreaction. If I can just get off my chest something that's worrying me in particular today. So this time last week, I dropped my 19-year-old son off at university in Glasgow. Since then, he's discovered, despite paying an absolute fortune and I'm paying out for his accommodation costs, he's having no face-to-face teaching of any kind. Most of the flats in his halls of residence have now been put into lockdown. It's now coming out from the Scottish Parliament that he's not allowed to come home, believe it or not. I've been listening to rumours all day that he may not even be allowed to come home for Christmas, although how this is going to be policed, I really don't know. And a number of things strike me as just outrageous about this. I mean, he described it to me in a text message exchange I had with him this morning as being in a medium security prison, only he's paying for the privilege and he's done nothing wrong. He does know lots of these students who have now tested positive for COVID, but he says nobody who he knows who's tested positive anything at all other than a mild cold symptoms. Right. He says nobody, and I think just the very statistic that you've got 124 students in his halls of residence having tested positive, but not one hospitalisation, not one doctor has even been called out as far as he's aware to these students. I think that just shows what an incredibly mild illness this is, fortunately, as his mother, fortunately.
For young people,
And yet on the basis of this less than a minor cold symptoms, they're having their entire education ruined, their mental health, as far as I'm concerned, put in jeopardy, and their social life completely destroyed as well. I just think the generational impact upon this is utterly appalling.
Toby, you've been a critic of these infringements on our liberties from the start. Two questions, really. A, are you still? I think the answer to that will be pretty straightforward. B, which we've been discussing a little earlier, what do you make of the level of compliance that we're seeing there? Are you surprised that there aren't more people saying, you know, we're largely a law-abiding nation, I guess, but there aren't more people saying, to hell with this, I'm going to allow tables of 8, or I'm going to go around to my friends' houses or not wear a mask or whatever. What's your take on where we've got to now on liberty intrusion, Toby?
Well, to answer your first question, Mark, as you predicted, I haven't changed my mind. And I'm delighted, actually, by how many people seem to be coming around to the sceptical point of view. When I started lockdownskeptics.org at the beginning of April, you could virtually count the number of mainstream journalists who were skeptical about the lockdown on one hand. Now I think it's approaching 50%. And you could also count the number of Tory MPs who were critical of the government's policy response on one hand. Now I think it's approaching 100. And I do think that if Graham Brady does table his amendment, I think the government might well be defeated, which is why I think the government will probably try and strike some deal with him rather than allow the amendment to be tabled. So I haven't changed my mind, and I'm really pleased that so many people are coming around to the sceptical point of view. On your second question, I think it's tempting to conclude, as you did earlier, that our sense of British exceptionalism and our belief that had we been invaded by Germany in 1940, we would have resisted and not complied. And the resistance movement would have put the French resistance to shame because the British bulldog spirit is irrepressible. It's tempting to dismiss that as a myth. And when you look around the world, countries which we have typically thought of as law-abiding, rule-bound countries like Germany have actually put up a much more energetic fight against the coronavirus restrictions than we have. Demonstrations in Berlin are attracting tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people, compared to a few hundred in Trafalgar Square.
Yeah.
So the temptation is to think, we've been kidding ourselves that we are a nation of,
liberty lovers,
yeomanry who will fight for our liberty to the death.
Well, it's not just the temptation; that's the goddamn evidence, isn't it?
Well, I think the one thing you can say in defence of the British people is that they have been scared half to death by what's been described as Project Fear on steroids. I think, as you said earlier, something like if you poll the British public and ask them what percentage of the British population they think have already died from coronavirus, the mean is 7%, which is something in the region of.
So we're not just compliant; we're stupid.
I think you. Given the way in which the virus has been presented in the mainstream media, given the daily Downing Street press briefings, given the grim expressions on the face of Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance when they made their presentation on Monday, it's not all that surprising that the public have been scared absolutely witless. It's been an unrelenting propaganda campaign informed by, behavioural scientists on stage who are advising the government about how to scare the bejesus out of people in order to get them to comply with the government guidance. So I would say in mitigation, I don't think it doesn't completely let us off the hook, but in mitigation, we have been successfully terrified by a very effective propaganda campaign. The one bit
these guys should have run the Remain campaign then if they wanted us to stay in the European Union, right?
Well, yeah, but it's the people who ran the Leave campaign that have been running this propaganda out of Downing Street, so it's not surprising it's been more effective.
Before I move on, Mike, I just want to come to you. Do you think that people will find smart ways, if you like, around the regulations by still being law-abiding? I mean, the favourite representation I've had in my 10 years here at the IEA was a staff member coming to me and saying, "Dear Mark, given the pubs now close at 10, can you please move the IEA working day from no longer being 9 to 5 and instead being 8 till 4? Right, that seems to me.
I've already been invited to about 4 illicit dinner parties, right? Which are not because we want to have illicit dinner parties, but just because we want to stick 2 fingers up to these people and go, I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to sneak in a 7th person, and they might not be actually a dinner party guest. They might be a cleaner. Because you start to think to yourself, you start to kind of drive yourself insane. Where you go, it's like I've seen some jokes about people planning weddings and go, look, we can't have more than 15 people at a wedding, so we're going to pretend it's a funeral, and then you can get 30. People are not stupid. I mean, there are some stupid people, and many of them voted to stay in the European Union, and many of them live in Clapham, as you well know. But the point is that, we are...
I only tick one of those boxes.
We are a relatively, individualist country. And despite the fact that this government is doing its level best to scare us, as Toby says quite rightly, they've got no basis for any of it. They've admitted now that they don't know why they came up with the rule of 6. They don't know why they came up with 10 o'clock as a curfew. They have no scientific evidence for any of it. None of the science is actually science. Apart from that, of course we're going to be guided by these morons. Why would we be? And more people than have been breaking the rules since day one.
I'm sure that's true, just not true in Clapham. It was my colleague Chris Snowden here that says a lot of this seems to come out of a random policy generator. I want to move on. Suzanne, you mentioned him earlier. To our next topic, the Labour Party's conference came to an end this week. What do we make of the still relatively new Labour Party leader, Keir Starmer? He's generally garnered, I think, pretty good reviews for his performance at the virtual Labour Party conference and then in the Commons. He's forensically cross-examining Jeremy Corbyn. In a recent Mori poll, he outperformed Boris Johnson on a number of leadership qualities. Wasn't all smooth sailing there. He's lost 3 people from their roles over the Overseas Operations Bill, which the government said is intended to shield soldiers from prosecution, and would previously be condemned by former Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn. Keir Starmer is Keir Pressure, we're calling it. He's a lawyer. Maybe he's forensic on cross-examining the government. He could be our next prime minister. The 2 major parties are about neck and neck in the polls. Suzanne, you mentioned him earlier and was sort of rather critical that you didn't think there was much of an opposition, but aren't the Labour Party under Keir Starmer's leadership in a rather stronger place than they were just a few months ago?
So, Mark, it's telling me my network bandwidth is low, so I'm not sure how much.
We can hear you loud and clear.
You can. Excellent. Great. That's good. As I was saying, I mean, he hasn't really been any opposition, certainly throughout the COVID crisis, because he's just been going along with everything the government's been saying, and then saying, but actually we need more restrictions, we need more draconian measures, we need more authoritarianism. His speech at party conference I thought was very interesting. And I think it's perhaps also an interesting example of how difficult it is if you're a political party leader who's used to making big rah-rah speeches in front of a big audience, how difficult it is to actually make a speech without an audience. Because to me, he came across as wooden. He wasn't looking at the camera once because of the way the auto cue had been set up, which also made him come across as being very insincere. So I'm really quite surprised, just on the basis of the physical presentation of his speech alone, that he got such good polling out of it. I think perhaps it says a lot about polling, which we all know a lot of us really don't trust very much. I think he's obviously trying to make a big thing about the fact he's second person is to be called Keir, who's leading the Labour Party. He comes from a working class background. He's a hotshot lawyer. He became the director of public prosecutions. But a lot of people remember his record on that actually wasn't so great. And of course, a lot of Labour supporters are also going to be remembering that he was the man who led the call to overturn the EU referendum. You might remember he famously said, "We are not the country of Nigel Farage," which was a kick in the teeth to 17.4 million people, if nothing else. And I think he still has a heck of a long way to go before he gets that red wall broken down again.
Well, that's interesting. But do you think he's made some, I mean, we at the IEA are more interested in trying to understand what he believes in than how he actually presents himself. But do you think, Suzanne, on some of these issues, he's got them right and closed them down? Here's a quote. He said Labour won't keep, quote, banging on about Europe. The debate between Leave and Remain is over. Says the party will never again go into an election with voters thinking it can't be trusted on national security, with your job, with your community and with your money. He seems to be taking a much tougher stance on anti-Semitism. Momentum criticised his speech. The Blairites praised it. This is quite a sort of shift, isn't it?
Yeah, it is absolutely a shift, and clearly there's a clear blue water between him and the Corbynista wing of the party. But I think, yes, his talk about Europe, we're not the party that's going to keep banging on in Europe. Again, as I say, he will not be forgotten as the man that tried to get the referendum overturned. The time for those words, for people like me, who actually, you might be surprised, Mark, I have voted Labour in the past. People like
always knew you were a dangerous left.
to try and win that Labour vote back. The time to have said something like that was the day after the EU referendum. It won't be forgotten.
Steve, I want to come back to you. Not so much on Keir Starmer's performance or how eloquent he is, but you've written a brilliant book about the political realignment of which sort of Brexit crystallised, and you've spoken a lot about where the Labour Party might end up, and it's got to find its core sort of beliefs, and I don't know whether that's a return to what it did. Is it going to be a liberal metropolitan elite party, or is it going to be the party of the working class blue collar? Can it actually straddle those two stools? Does Brexit mean it's impossible to? What do you make of where Sir Keir Starmer is positioning the Labour Party? What are we to make of his or the Labour Party's sort of ideology now? Where are they coming from? Who and what do they represent, Steve?
Well, I think the conference this year has been really interesting with regard to that question. What I said, and what I think most observers have said, is that social democratic parties all across Europe, not just the Labour Party, have a big problem, which is that their electorate is split into two different groups of people. Their traditional working class vote, which is very left-wing on economics very often, but culturally, socially, traditionalist and conservative, and a newer block of younger voters who are typically better educated, been to university, live in large metropolitan areas, who are sort of very anti-capitalist, but without any focused economic ideas, but also very much into what you might call woke identity politics. Now, the decision that he has to make, and the Labour Party has to make, is which of the two halves of their electorate do they basically make their base? Because it's almost impossible to keep both of those lots of voters happy at the same time. That's the big strategic problem they have. Now, I think the evidence is pretty clear that he's decided to go for the Labour Party's traditional working class identity, because he's doing a series of things which are pissing off Momentum and what you might call the woke metropolitan left. And I imagine that actually he and his office, if they get hostile tweets from Momentum, they think, great, we're doing the right thing. Because what he wants to do is to recapture those red wall seats. He's got a long way to go, as Suzanne said. He does have a long way to go. I'm sure he's well aware of that. He's a smart man. But he's definitely chosen, I think, to go down the route of reasserting the kind of traditional socialist but patriotic identity of the old Labour Party. Now, the question is, what are those woke voters going to do? They may desert for the Green Party, but with our electoral system, that's not going to hurt the Labour Party too much. Who else are they going to vote for? They are in a difficult position because it's not clear that there's an electoral alternative that they have.
Davies and the Liberal Democrats.
Well, maybe. They certainly seem to be making a pitch for that vote. That is a possibility. Or they may just stop voting and go into activist single-issue politics, which would effectively remove them from the electoral calculation. Now, you could say that in the longer run, that's the part of the electorate that is growing. But actually, I think, who knows what the electorate's going to be like in 30 years' time. I think in the short term, like the next 10 years, he's made the right choice, the right call myself. He's got a big task ahead of him to try and change the internal culture of the party. But I think the evidence of this year is that he's made a clear, decisive move in that direction. I also think, by the way, contrary to what Suzanne says, I think the public has already sort of like mentally moved on from Brexit, and they've forgotten the fact that Keir Starmer was the man who...
Suzanne will never forget. Never forget. Never forgive, never forget.
She's got a longer memory on this issue than most voters, I suspect. And the thing is, I think he just wants the whole thing out of the way, a deal done, so that he can concentrate on putting forward this kind of, as I say, very traditional, actually, kind of Attlee-style Labour agenda, which he thinks is going to help him win back those seats in the north, and it may well do.
Mike, when I was saying Keir Starmer was receiving rave reviews from some quarters, I think I saw you shaking your head. What's, Mike, your early views and analysis of the new Labour leader?
Plank of the week again this week, I'm afraid, and he does quite often make it onto Plank of the Week, a show that we do at talkRADIO, which obviously is very, very heavily. There's so much competition for it, I guess. The problem for me with Keir Starmer is that I've watched the Labour Party. I used to work in Scotland, right? I watched the Labour Party lose Scotland. Yeah. They're never getting it back. They lost it to the SNP because they thought for such a long time that they controlled Scotland. The Labour Party without Scotland can never get back into government because they used to have 40 seats in Scotland. Now they have hardly any, right? They've lost the Scottish Parliament. Tony Blair's great idea was to kill off Scottish nationalism by giving them devolution. That worked out well, didn't it? Right? They've now lost the north of England. Keir Starmer will never get it back because the working class, ordinary people of this country don't like wokeism. They're not interested. They don't care about transgender rights. They don't give a stuff about LGBT nonsense. They don't want their children to be taught about Black History Month in the midst of October 2020. They just want to get out of the European Union. They want to have a chance to have their kids go to college, maybe if they can. And they're not interested in this kind of ideological bullshit, if you'll pardon my expression. And Keir Starmer has lost the north of England. Labour have lost the north of England. And they're now a minority party. They'll never get back into power. And all this nonsense about, he's so clever, he's a lawyer. Some of the most stupid people I know are lawyers. I mean, look at Jolyon Moron. This is the most stupid man that's ever walked the earth. And yet he's a QC, he's a barrister, apparently. Labour are done. They're finished.
Wow. Interesting take. Joanna, let me come back to you. What do you make of Keir Starmer? I mean, I guess over the dispatch box, you'd expect him to be good. He's spent the better part of 25 years directly involved in arguing legal cases, 21 of those years at least cross-examining people. What do you make, Joanna, of him and where he's taking the party? Is it a write-off, or, as Steve suggests, is he sort of returning the Labour Party to its original roots after the period under Jeremy Corbyn, which is sort of anomalous in Labour Party history, I guess? Joanna?
Well, I'm sure he's convinced himself that that's what he's doing. I think he thinks he would like to appeal once more to the working class red wall voters. But I don't believe for one second that the woke politics that has come to dominate the Labour Party over the past decades has actually been dropped. I think there's just a bit of a strategy here not to talk about these issues. And I actually agree with Suzanne. I've got a long memory too. I think Starmer would be very, very happy for us all to forget that the Labour Party's role in Brexit. But I think it's down to the likes of us to make sure that he's not allowed to get away with us all just conveniently developing historical amnesia around this point. We need to remind people at every step of the way just exactly how anti-democratic the Labour Party is. But my concern is, it's all very well just to agree not to talk about issues like gender, but you leave a vacuum then. I other than not being Corbyn, and other than kind of wanting to stop us talking about Brexit and not talk about culture wars issues, what does Starmer actually stand for? Shift away the platitudes. I think the reason why he won't be successful in winning back northern voters or working class voters is not because of any kind of stylistic thing. It's simply because there's no positive vision of society here. I mean, Suzanne again made the point earlier that there's no opposition to the lockdown that we're going through here, but there's no opposition to the green agenda. There's no opposition to kind of banning petrol cars. There's no opposition to the economic devastation that the country's undergoing at the moment. If Starmer was to come out with a real positive plan for economic growth and development, for jobs, at the end of the day, it seems to me when I've talked to people in my hometown of Middlesbrough, what people want is they want jobs that are well paid and secure. And if Starmer was to come out with a plan for that, I think that would be electoral victory. But he cannot. He's absolutely incapable of doing that.
Toby, I want your thoughts. You're Britain's sort of leading campaigner and spokesperson against cancel culture and in favour of freedom of speech. Steve was suggesting that being criticised by Momentum and the woke brigade would be music to Keir Starmer's ears. Is what he should be trying to aspire to here is to have Prince Harry and Meghan take to the airwaves to slam him? Would that be the pinnacle of his achievement? Just in parenthesis there, I hear from some Republican friends in America that Meghan is dubbed by GOP campaigners as Woko Ono, is what they're now calling Meghan in the context of the US election. On your cancel culture, freedom of speech crusades there, Toby, has the Labour Party moved at all in your direction or not?
I think it has moved a little bit. Jeremy Corbyn was completely captured by the woke cult. Keir Starmer evidently isn't. And I think I agree with Steve that pivoting towards the non-woke part of the Labour Party's quarrelsome coalition is strategically the right move. I think Keir Starmer's difficulty is that he's kind of the woke class. He's very much someone whose colleagues, whose peers are all woke. He's not someone who can embody the other side of that Labour coalition. And I think so. He's got that difficulty. How persuasive is he going to be in persuading former Labour voters in red wall seats that he genuinely is patriotic, that he genuinely cares about the issues they care about, that he's not on the side of the woke in these culture war issues that Mike flagged up? I think he's got a difficulty there. That's a difficult job because he just doesn't appear to be that kind of guy. I think more generally,
because he's from the sort of liberal North Londonish elite.
He's from the kind of metropolitan elite class who we all know are kind of woke and holier than thou and a little bit superior and look down their noses at working class people in red wall seats. But in addition, I think he's got this problem, which is that he's not a natural politician. I sat next to him in the Today program studio a couple of months ago, and you could see he was slightly awkward. He wasn't particularly fluent or eloquent. That wasn't his element. My father had the great pleasure, the great honor of dining with FDR in the White House in the 1930s. Long story, won't bore you with that. But he said the great quality that he had, in addition to being kind of magnetic and having this kind of extraordinary kind of strength of character, he was incredibly inclusive. He was big tent. He has a hail fellow, well-met guy. When he talked to you, when he focused on you, you really felt that he wanted to talk to you, was interested in what you had to say. He had that kind of natural ability to appeal to people, to make that connection with people. Clinton had it. JFK had it.
Tony Blair had it. Tony Blair had it. Boris, I think, has it to a certain degree, but I don't think the contest next time will be between Boris and Keir Starmer. I think Boris is probably a busted flush. He probably won't go as quickly as people imagine, but I don't think he's going to survive until the next general election. Likely to be a Rishi-Keir contest. And Rishi, whatever you might think of his behavior during this crisis, he's a natural. He's a natural politician. He's the conservative Tony Blair. Keir versus Rishi, I'm going to give it to Rishi because Keir just seems a bit awkward on the stump. He doesn't have that hail fellow well-met quality. He doesn't really seem interested in people. He's a bit of an introvert. Whereas Rishi is warm. He's a lover of life. He's got a little bit of charisma. He's risen very quickly. He has those qualities that Blair had that Starmer just doesn't have. Toby, you've been a great help here, because just before I move on to the next topic, I have an absolute rule on Live with Littlewood that we need to get in at least one betting tip, which you've just given your fellow panellists and the audience, and one mention at least of Southampton Football Club, of which Rishi Sunak is a devout supporter, as am I. So 2 birds killed with 1 stone, thanks to Toby's answer. I want to move, just for people's thoughts on our last topic. We're calling it the hate debate. A new report from the Law Commission has said that women should be protected under hate crime laws. The Commission says misogyny should be treated like racism or homophobia. It's currently consulting on whether ageism, homelessness, or being a member of an alternative subculture, such as goths, punks, or presumably appearing on Live with Littlewood, should also be added to the list of hate crime motivations. The report also coincides with this week's announcement by Equalities Minister Liz Truss that the government's ruling out changes to the Gender Recognition Act. Initial proposals would have allowed people to self-ID, to change their legal gender without the approval or confirmation of a doctor or some other officials. That's dismayed some transgender activists. It's also dismayed, I understand, just before we went live, Crispin Blunt MP, who's called on Liz Truss to resign. Joanna, what's your take on this? This is a total identity politics issue, which I've just given you 2 ins into. One, this, should women be a protected group? Second, what is a woman and who decides? I just, self-ID myself if I want to. Joanna, what are your thoughts?
So, as a woman, I think this is the most patronising load of bollocks I've heard in a long time. The idea that I need to be protected from misogyny is laughable, absolutely laughable. I mean, 2 things on that. Firstly, the idea that we live in a misogynistic society today, I think just doesn't stand up to scrutiny. You do any research into any aspect of women's lives today, from education, employment, earnings, certainly middle-class women, and it's middle-class women, let's be honest, who are coming up with these ideas that we need new hate speech laws. It's not working-class women who are juggling cleaning jobs with looking after their kids and trying to scrape by on a little bit of money, who are chomping at the bit for misogyny to be made a hate crime. This is Stella Creasy, this is feminist campaigners, this is elite Labour Party women in Parliament, and also, this is. I disagree with Toby that the Labour Party have budged. Keir Starmer will not be coming out and so much as questioning this new hate speech legislation. He will be chomping at the bit for this to be passed. It's patronising, it's insulting, it's unnecessary. It's a threat to free speech. I mean, and it's a threat to women's free speech. As we know, Amber Rudd, ex-Home Secretary, was herself investigated for having committed a hate crime incident for a speech she gave at the Conservative Party conference that talked about not wanting jobs to go to immigrants. This is the most illiberal legislation it's possible to dream up. And yet, like I said, my concern is there will be no opposition to this from the Labour Party. There'll be very, very little opposition to it altogether. And it almost seems to me as if there's some trade-off has gone on where Liz Truss has been allowed to say that we're not going to make these changes to the Gender Recognition Act, and almost in compensation then for that, as a sop to the wokerati, we're now tightening up hate crime legislation, but it's not on, and women shouldn't be used as a pawn in this political game. Shouldn't allow themselves to be used as a pawn in this game of illiberality.
Well, as has already been pointed out by Mike and others, I'm a wet Clapham compliant kind of person, and I don't want to be accused of a hate crime, so I'm also going to positively discriminate in favour of the women here and ask Suzanne next what her opinions are. How do you self-identify around these issues, Suzanne?
Well, I can tell you what I absolutely don't value self-identify as, and that's a cis woman. I think that word should be absolutely expunged from the dictionary. Joanna has put everything so utterly beautifully. I'm not sure there's much I can add, except to say that I absolutely 100% agree with everything she said. I think my position on this really is that the whole idea of a hate crime is an utter nonsense. All crime is hateful. My position would be that the whole idea of hate crime should be completely exonerated, should just go. It should just go. It's also subjective. It totally depends on the supposition of the victim, and it's become a nonsense. I think the final thing that made me convinced this was such nonsense happened actually last year, when you might remember Gwent police were bragging about a criminal that they'd caught, and a lot of people decided to laugh at his haircut. And to my astonishment, Gwent police then put out a tweet saying that they should be careful because criticising his appearance could be a hate crime. I mean, just you can't criticise a criminal's haircut. The world's gone utterly mad. So the whole thing should go. The other thing that should go is this idea in equality law of protected characteristics. I think that has caused a massive amount of division and problems, particularly when you have some groups which have protected characteristics and they have protection in law, which actually behave in a very discriminatory way to other minorities. So the Equality Act needs tearing up, totally rewriting. Crime is crime, and if there are circumstances in which crime is deemed by a judge to be particularly nasty that the sentence should be increased, then that's fine. But I think that should be left to judge and jury. Let's get rid of hate crimes as a legislative idea. Let's get rid of protected characteristics. Let's just be very simple and treat everybody equally.
Mike, you're going to completely agree with that. Which are the protected groups that you want hate crimes for, Mike Graham? Or do you agree it's not just about the women issue and the transgender issue? The problem is we've started to put people in groups, and then, potentially crimes against people in that category are different.
It has to be said, Mark, and you're not quite there yet, but, the white sort of middle-aged, father figure, as I am, who continues to have to send money abroad to my various progeny, who are working in various parts of the world, who seemingly still don't have enough money to pay their rent because they are so busy spending their time having a good time. I'm never going to be protected by any of these laws. And I had a very good conversation actually with Alex Phillips, former Brexit Party MEP this week, because she, and I'm not telling tales out of school, admitted on live radio that she had been the victim of a sexual assault. And she actually surprised me by being very pro this whole idea of hate crime for misogyny. Because she said, it's not just about wolf whistling in the street, which is pathetic and ridiculous. And I must admit, I've never wolf whistled a woman in my life. I don't think anybody sensible would do that now. However, I said to her, well, look, here's the thing. There are already rules in place. If somebody rapes you, there is a criminal code which can prosecute you. Now, whether or not they are motivated by hate because you're a woman seems to me to be completely irrelevant. because you still have to prove the crime. Now, the reason that rape convictions are so small percentage-wise is because it's a he said, she said scenario. By making it a hate crime, that doesn't make it any different. You still won't be able to prosecute more men for raping women because you still have to prove that it actually happened. So it seems to me that, we should, I think I agree with Suzanne, we should do away with all hate crime. We shouldn't make it more of a problem that you murdered somebody because they were black or because they were, gay or because they were a woman. You murdered them, therefore you're going to be charged with murder. It's as simple as that, really. I mean, I can't imagine why anybody would want to sort of layer it with anything else, really.
Toby, I fear we're going to get a unanimous agreement here. Is this, this is a sort of, collective identity politics. I mean, crimes should be crimes, shouldn't they? We shouldn't have protected groups. If you rape someone, punch someone, what your motivation was and whether they're black, white, female, male, transgender, Muslim, Christian, agnostic, atheist, shouldn't really be a feature, should it?
No, and this is a point made very forcefully by Jonathan Rauch in Kindly Inquisitors, which I would recommend to anyone watching this broadcast. He makes the point that if you impose a higher tariff for crimes because they're motivated by hatred, so two people can commit the same crime, but if someone commits that crime and they're motivated by hatred for the group that the victim is a member of, then you're effectively criminalizing thought. You're creating a new category of crime, which is thought crime. And I think that distills what's wrong with hate crime legislation. It's saying, let's punish crimes which are committed by people who have certain thoughts more severely than we would punish exactly the same crimes committed by people who don't have those thoughts. And that has to be unjust. This proposal, I think it's been sort of framed in the media as, should we include misogyny in the should we include sex, gender as one of the protected characteristics, so we can punish more severely crimes committed by people who are motivated by hatred of women. That I think that makes it in some ways sound more benign than it is. I mean, first of all, there's the wolf whistling point, which Mike dismissed as a trivial point, but I think it has some force in that at the moment, according to the hate crime official guidance in England and Wales, police are required to investigate what might be hate crimes. And if they don't turn out to be hate crimes, they then have to record them as non-crime hate incidents. And the Daily Telegraph did an FOI request recently and found out that police forces in England and Wales have recorded 120,000 non-crime hate incidents over the past 5 years, which by my calculations is about 65 a day. You wonder why police don't investigate burglaries, auto theft. It's because they're too busy investigating people misgendering one another on Twitter, because they're obliged to do that by the hate crime official guidance. And imagine how much busier the police will be if they have to investigate wolf whistling as a potential hate crime and then record it, do the paperwork, record it against people's names as a non-crime hate incident. But more seriously, that's only the tip of the iceberg in the proposals that have been put forward by the Law Commission, in which they're currently consulting about. A professor of law at Swansea.
I think may have lost Toby there. Hope we can get him back to get his Live with Littlewood optimism rating. Toby, have we got you back? Let me go to Steve.
Steve, you back, haven't you?
Oh yeah, I think we've just about got Toby back. Yes, just finish your thought, and then I need your optimism rating, Toby. It sounded like that was sinking towards zero rapidly.
I just wanted to say that the wanting to include sex as a protected characteristic is the tip of the iceberg in what the Law Commission are consulting about. Andrew Tettenborn, Professor of Law at Swansea University on the Legal Advisory Council of the Free Speech Union, he's read the document. He says it's like the Scottish hate crime bill on steroids. It's going to be even more draconian, even more censorious, an even bigger assault on free speech than what's currently being proposed by Scotland. And one example he gave was they want to extend hate crimes to domestic dwellings, i.e. households. So if you say something which could be designated a hate crime, I mean, let's suppose they include it to include misogyny. If you say something misogynistic to your son in your household, that could, under these proposals, be classified as a hate crime, and you could go to jail for that. So if you say that woman on the telly, I quite fancy her, she's got a nice pair, you could end up in prison for saying that to your son in your own household. It's unbelievably Orwellian and draconian, and we have to marshal all our forces to prevent this proposal from coming into law.
So on that cheery note, Toby, what's your optimism rating for the next 2 or 3 years? You've talked yourself down from whatever you were going to give, right?
I think I've always been pretty low when I've appeared on Live with Littlewood, Mark. But I'm...
Anybody going to guess? We've lost Toby again.
I'm going with 4. I think he's 4.
Oh, 3.
I think he's much less than 4.
You reckon? I'm going to give him a 4. I do
think that the time...
Toby, we lost you again just before your number. What's your number?
2.
2?
Oh, wow.
Blimey. Okay, Struth. Mike, what's your number? We were guessing as we just lost you for a bit there. What's your number, Mike?
You're going to be shocked by my number. Do you know what my number is?
Go on.
Because I'm such an optimist. My number is actually 7.
Wow. 7? You're the most optimistic panelist. Why is it a 7? Just tell us why it's a 7, then I'll get the last.
Why it's a 7, because I actually do have faith in the country. I do have faith in the people. I don't have faith in the government, but I know that we will get there. And if we all just make sure that we sort of tick the little box that says we will get through this, we will get through it.
Well, okay, a good 7, the highest so far. Joanna, how optimistic are you feeling? This is over the next 2 or 3 years. How freedom and prosperous will Britain be on a scale of 1 to 10? 0 to 10, I should say, actually.
Can we go below 0?
No. That really screws up my maths if you go below 0.
No.
0, because, I mean, very honestly, I can't remember a time I personally felt more depressed about the situation in this country. I think every aspect of society that you look at in terms of personal liberties, in terms of the economy, but even just that sense of there being such a thing as society, of people having human contact and relationships with each other. I think we have been so ground down and so screwed over. I find it hard. I'm really struggling to find any reasons for optimism. I think people have been scared senseless, and people are really struggling right now. I mean, to put a very sad and somber note on the end of the proceedings, and you won't thank me for this, but I personally have had more people contacting me over the past week, particularly since Boris Johnson made his announcement about 6 months, quite seriously talking about not seeing reasons to carry on living. And they are not saying that as a joking comment or in any way lighthearted. I think this has affected a lot of people very, very badly. People who've built up businesses who are now looking at seeing these businesses be ruined. People who haven't seen friends and family and relatives, haven't had holidays, not able to get married. I think people's lives are being absolutely devastated.
Suzanne, you got to cheer us up a little bit. Well, you don't have to, but you can only go as low as 0. What's your number, Suzanne?
I'm not sure how much I will cheer you up, actually. I think if you'd asked me this question at the beginning of the year, Mark, when we were coming out, January the 31st, we were out of the European Union. We had Boris as Prime Minister, this supposedly great libertarian, positive Prime Minister. I'd have said it would have been a 10. And I'm very much a glass half full person, always have been. But I'm really sorry to hear Joanna say what she said, but I totally agree with it. I mean, these times have been dire. My mental health has been on the floor, and I am one of the most optimistic, I think, level-headed, sensible, this too will pass kind of people I know. I've had 4 people I know personally kill themselves during the lockdown period. 4. I'm 55 years old. Prior to that, I'd know 6 people who killed themselves. I don't think there's any coincidence that I now know 4 who died in the last few months. And that is shocking. So yes, it's grim, and I can't really see much way forward at the moment. As I said earlier, partly because I think the British people have been so damned compliant about the whole thing, which I think has depressed me most. So you need a number. I'll give you a 3.
3, pretty low. Steve, any reason to cheer us up? The final number's yours while I do the math.
I'm going to give you a 6. And the reason why I'm the most optimistic, apart from one of the people
Mike was a 7, yeah.
Mike's a 7, yeah. Is simply because of historical perspective. It's very easy to think that this is unprecedentedly bad, but actually it's not. Things have been a lot worse than this, and many times in human history. Even with what Toby was saying, this is not a new argument. The argument that you should punish motive, not act, is something the Puritans thought. This is an idea that keeps on popping up. It's there is nothing new under the sun, as the wise man said. And so, I'm going to give you a 6.
Okay, I myself am going to be a 4. I'm usually a down the middle 5 because I feel I have to be a neutral commentator, but it's a 4 because Southampton have got off to such a terrible start to the season, so that knocks a point off my standard 5, which, if I'm correct, we in aggregate come out at 3.7 recurring. So probably one of the more pessimistic panels looking forward, and there might be some stuff to be pessimistic about. Mike has his Plank of the Week award. I've got mine now, Nanny of the Week award. That goes to Hammersmith and Fulham Council. They've told staff they shouldn't smoke at their desk when they're working from home. The council told staff that any part of their house they use for working would require to be smoke-free. Forest, the pro-choice group on smoking, described that as a war on choice and personal freedom. The chairman of the Local Governments Association Community Wellbeing Board says it shows that councils are being responsible employers. Well, I'm going to enjoy the remainder of this here whilst I'm actually sitting at my desk at work. Thank you very much to Steve, Mike, Suzanne, Joanna, Toby. Thanks to our previous guests, Rob, Patrick and Andrew. It's been great to have you all on the show. Live with Littlewood is taking a break next week, but we'll be back on Tuesday, the 6th of October. Before then, however, you can join us at our spectator event that we're holding on Monday from 5:45 to 6:15 at the Spectator Alternative Conference. We'll be asking whether the war on obesity is another tip of an iceberg. On that panel, we have Chris Snowdon, our own head of lifestyle economics here at the IEA, Dolly Tice, Steve Brine, MP, and another chance to see the wonderful Joanna Williams, and it will be hosted by Kate Andrews, now at the Spectator, formerly of this parish. If you've been watching on YouTube and you've enjoyed the show, please click the thumbs up. If you're not yet a subscriber to the IEA London channel, we're very close to now getting to 8,000 subscribers. Help us get over the line on that. And if you want to keep abreast of what we're doing on the podcast side, if you're not always watching us on YouTube, then please go to iepodcast.podbean.com. Stay safe, try and cheer up if you've got problems or are feeling down, look for help. And we'll be back to try and help you all navigate your way through these dark and bleak times that came out at 3.8 on Tuesday, October the 6th. Thanks very much to all of you. Over.